Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 144 and a half. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to Singapore. Learn about where you can find pungent fruit, a good tuxedo, and a Singapore sling in this island nation. Today on the Amateur Traveler.
I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have some news for you. The first piece of news is on a personal level. I forgot to mention that last week was, in fact, the 3-year anniversary of the Amateur Traveler. I'd like to send thanks out to all of you who have written in and encouraged me over the last 3 years. There are some weeks, this week included, where I think maybe I should just hang up my shingle. It's just too much work, but it's your emails, your letters, your comments that keep me going. So thanks so much for 3 years. In other news, you may have heard that Cruise West, which is something we mentioned way back on Amateur Traveler episode 21 about cruising to Alaska by small boat, had a little mishap where they ran aground. They stranded 51 people. This because Cruise West does have smaller boats near Glacier Bay in Alaska. Everyone was evacuated from the boats safely. And the strangest news story of the week is probably this one. A first-class passenger on a Delta flight apparently became so angry that coach-class passengers were able to exit his jet before he could that he yanked open an emergency hatch and slid down the chute. And in the second strangest travel story from the week, American Airlines cancels a flight due to hostile passengers. A flight from Florida to New York Sunday never got off the ground. That's because after the flight crew arrived late, angry and impatient passengers got verbally agitated and hostile. Apparently it was so bad the crew wasn't comfortable working the flight, so they refused to take off. For links to those stories and a few other stories that I didn't have time to mention, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome Jeremy on the show, and Jeremy has come to talk to us about Singapore. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and congratulations on 3 years.
Thank you very much. I'm going to welcome you back to the show. I called this at the beginning of the episode 144 and a half. We actually recorded half of this episode, or at least we went through half of the interview before I found out that it wasn't being recorded. So I appreciate your patience here. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with Singapore. Now, you lived there for a while.
Yes, I moved over with my family due to my father's work. In 1998, lived there for 4 years, attended a private American school there. And then basically every year since, I've had the opportunity to travel back and seen Singapore change over the years.
Now, when we talked yesterday, you said you thought it probably took a week or 2 weeks to see Singapore. What would you see with a 1 or 2 week itinerary?
Sure. Some different things I'd recommend, different sites to see in Singapore would be Chinatown would be definitely a good place to kind of start. Chinatown is essentially an area where the ethnic Chinese kind of settled down. And you'll find it really stands out because there's a lot of shop houses. Traditional shop houses are basically the bottom level is normally a store or a shop of some sort. And then the top half of the building are where the families would sleep and stay.
Mm-hmm.
There's a variety of different shopping there. I think the neatest thing to see in Chinatown is definitely they have traditional Chinese medicine shops. And there you'll find all kinds of neat, particular kind of roots that they use for, you name it, for the common cold, all kinds of different teas. And I always found that very fascinating there. A nice resource to get you through Chinatown a little bit, especially as a tourist, and if you're new to it, is if you go to the website visitsingapore.com, you'll find some links to a Singapore official walking tours.
Oh, okay.
It's very easy, very accessible. It's actually very reasonable price-wise. And someone, or maybe even a few people, will take you on a tour and show you kind of the highlights. And some of the things in Chinatown that it's definitely worth the time to see is the Surya Mariamman Temple, which is a Hindu temple. And really, you'll be able to see it if you're there. It stands out all kinds of the different Hindu gods on the roof of it. The Thian Hock Keng Temple and the Buddha Tooth Relic Temple. Chinatown is also a very interesting place to visit during Chinese New Year, which is normally end of January, beginning of February, Lunar New Year. Normally all the shop houses, the people that live in the shop houses will bring out, and basically it's a giant kind of street bazaar, and you can go and experience. And the thing that you get during that festival and during that time is pulled pork, a type of pork that you can get and cook. And normally there's long lines for those.
And is that a sandwich or a plate or what?
It's a marinated type of pork that you can purchase. And normally the Chinese people use it in a whole bunch of, or I should say Singaporean people use it in a whole bunch of different dishes. And for whatever reason, whenever they cook around the New Year, they need this particular kind. But normally there's a few that are traditionally, and they always make the news, and it's a very big deal there. I've been by there during Chinese New Year when there's been at least 40 people in the line waiting to get it.
Oh, wow. That's some good pork.
Yeah, I've never tried any myself. Maybe I have in a dish or so. Another place to see in Singapore is Orchard Road. This is kind of the downtown area. It reminds me a lot of, in Chicago, you have Magnificent Mile, where there's all the higher end and some good hotels. I always kind of use it as my home base area, especially if you have a day to kind of kill or you're kind of getting over jet lag. Yeah, definitely recommend. Just wander down Orchard Road and you never really know what you'll find. There's kind of the Tangs Mall. It kind of reminds you of a little bit of Macy's, but it's the Singapore version. There's normally things going on all the time, especially during Christmas area and even Chinese New Year. You'll find they bring out a lot of shops there. But also Orchard Road, that's normally when they decorate during Christmas. They decorate the entire road all the way down. It's normally probably, I'd say, about 2.5 miles, 3 miles of just beautiful decorations during Christmas. There's also a big variety of foods and all kinds of very interesting restaurants throughout there as well. Also, unfortunately or fortunately, if you really like Starbucks or McDonald's, basically every 5 minutes walking, you'll run into one.
So it's actually a very modern area.
Oh, yeah. Singapore in general is a very modern and especially technologically advanced city. But yeah, you'll be able to find there's a lot of tall buildings down Orchard. It's actually fun just to look up a few times. I think a lot of times people are just kind of concentrating on the pedestrian traffic. But if you look up, it's very beautiful. Another place in Singapore, especially for a week to 2 weeks to go visit, it's kind of their response to a resort island. It is part of Singapore. You don't need a special visa or anything. It's called Sentosa. Sentosa, it's basically, they have a bunch of different little attractions that you can go and participate at. And recently I've heard, I haven't been for many years, but recently I've heard they've invested a lot of money in making it better. And one thing, though, that's been there for a while is called the Images of Singapore. This is a wax museum that gives you a good, brief historical account of what happened and how Singapore became Singapore. And It shows some history about Sir Stamford Raffles, British person that colonized Singapore in 1819, and what has happened throughout the years. Another kind of attraction there to see if you like aquatic life, they do have Underwater World. And at night, you can see the Songs of the Sea, which is a laser light showcase. It used to be free. Now it's only a few Singapore dollars. I'm not a big laser light person, but I definitely thought it was worth seeing, especially after a long day. It's nice to just kind of end the day with that. Another area to check out is Boat Quay and Clark Quay. This is an area near the business district, which is the southern part of the island. It's just adjacent to the Singapore River. And this is where you'll find a bunch of different restaurants. There's good nightlife there, a lot of different clubs. And this is also a place where you can ride traditional Chinese junks. And they're very affordable. It's very cheap. And they'll take you up and down the Singapore River, and they'll do a brief overview, a little bit of the different bridges and a few of the different buildings. And also in that area, new as of, I think, 2 years ago, the Esplanade. It reminds you a lot. In Sydney, Australia, they have the Opera House. Well, Singapore, it's the Esplanade. It's the performing arts area. They have theaters. They have the Singapore Symphony Orchestra plays there, and it's a very interesting shaped building. It's silver-ish. It reminds you of, some people say, the durian. It's a cultural item there that's very important. The durian is, they consider it the king of the fruits. It's kind of spiky, and it has a very strong smell. Normally, I say it smells a little bit like gasoline or turpentine a little bit, but it's definitely a delicacy, and the Singaporeans absolutely love it. There's certain times of the year for when you can obtain the durian. You'll see signs everywhere. They're not allowed on public transportation. You'll get fined. I have not tried it myself. I hope to this December when I go back. Botanical Garden is something that's overlooked a lot when people visit Singapore. It's very west off of Orchard Road. And it is nice in the beginning of the day or the end of the day when it's a little bit cooler. You can definitely go and walk through it. There's a lot of different neat trees and neat plants. Due to Singapore's climate, you'll notice it's a very beautiful city. There's a lot of trees, especially a lot of orchids. Orchids tend to grow really well there, and they actually have the National Orchid Garden in the Botanical Gardens there. It's only a few dollars, Singapore dollars, and they actually have a neat section. It's called the VIP Orchid Garden, where if any famous dignitaries have visited, they make a hybrid of the orchid and name it after them. For example, Nelson Mandela came, Margaret Thatcher, just to name a few. Another thing to see is the Raffles Hotel. This is closer to the business district. It's on Beach Road. It used to be where Singapore ended, the southern part of the island that actually used to be a beach.
Okay.
Singapore over the years have reclaimed land, so Singapore is actually growing, and they actually have a whole new area down there, which is another place I'd recommend to stay if you're going to stay in a hotel. The Raffles Hotel, which is named after Sir Stamford Raffles, the one that colonized Singapore, is a very traditional, classic architecture building. There's a lot to do in it. That's probably the most expensive place to stay in Singapore, and it's a great place to see and even just to visit as a tourist. At Raffles Hotel, there's the Long Bar, which is where the drink Singapore Sling was created.
And what is in a Singapore Sling?
It's a bunch of different fruit juices, pineapple juice. It's kind of pinkish look. It's very good. But the Long Bar itself is also a neat place just to visit, just for the ambiance of it.
And the Raffles Hotel is a colonial-style hotel?
Yes, colonial style. It takes you back. It feels like you're in 1920s, 1930s Singapore. Mm-hmm. And that's where, especially when the British basically ran Singapore, that's essentially the hotel of choice. A new attraction that just was built in Singapore probably about a year and a half ago is called the Singapore Flyer. This is very similar to the London Eye in London, England. I have not personally been out, but I've heard you get a very nice view, especially of the business district and a little bit of the central area of Singapore. Another area that is definitely worth during the week-long trip that you're there, and you can spend a little bit of time here, is called Holland Village. This is an area of Singapore that has a lot of shops. I've heard everything from there could be 400 to 1,000. I hear all different numbers, but there's a lot of shops crammed into one little area. And this is where you can get some neat food. There are some touristy things, but they also have a lot of tailors in this area as well.
And when you say tailors, you mentioned yesterday that there are people coming up to you asking you if you want to buy a new suit.
Oh, yes. The tailors all over Singapore, I mean, especially on Orchard Road, too, you'll find them. Even in Chinatown, there's a lot of tailors, and it's actually very affordable. If you need to get a business suit, if you're on business, or I've had tuxedo made, I've had suits made, I've had shirts made, and it's very affordable, and normally they can get it done, especially it depends on what you get. You can get it within a week. Even I've gotten a few shirts made within a week when I've stayed there.
And when you get a new tuxedo made, that's for wearing to the raffles or where?
Generally, you don't find in Singapore that people wear formal, like what we consider in the United States as formal wear. Normally what they'll say is smart casual. By smart casual means basically not the typical kind of t-shirt. You can wear a nice button-down t-shirt. If you go see the Singapore Symphony Orchestra, SSO, I would definitely recommend you can wear smart casual. That's what I normally do.
And I assume part of that is just the weather. I'm picturing hot and steamy.
Oh, very hot and steamy. It's a few degrees above the equator. So pretty much year-round, it's going to be upper 80s, lower 90s, and it's extremely humid, so very tropical.
Well, you had said that it was a place where orchids grow readily. Here we grow them in hothouses. So that gave me a good impression of what we were talking about.
Yep, exactly. So, yeah, I'd get tuxedos for other purposes I had needed for playing trumpet. But yeah, in Holland Village, too, one place that my family and I would always go to, and I always go back anytime I need electronics. There's all kinds of different opportunities and places you can go in Singapore for electronics. But one place I really recommend, it's a family-owned place. It's literally a hole-in-the-wall place, and they have electronics in boxes stacked all the way up to the ceiling, is this place called Paris Silk. I went there when I went in 98. I wanted a camera to take pictures of my experiences. Walked in there and talked to them, and they gave me a very good price. You don't really barter. You don't really find bartering so much in more of the retail places in Singapore. There's a few places in Chinatown you can barter. Museums. For people that really enjoy museums, I'm a museum person. I really enjoy it. One that they just remodeled, I think they did an amazing job. It's called the National Museum of Singapore. It's near there's a MRT stop, the Mass Rapid Transit. The National Museum of Singapore showcases a little bit of their history, and it also shows more cultural connections within Singapore. So it will give you a history, but it's very personal.
You mean for the different nationalities? I know it's a really melting pot in Singapore.
Yeah, it is a melting pot, and the National Museum of Singapore tries to give you a historical and also kind of the development of how, if you were Chinese and you immigrated to Singapore in the 30s, well, how would the country look, and stepped you through. And it's very interesting. When you go to the museum, actually it's an old Parliament building. It's very old architecture, but they've made it a little bit more modern. But you go in and you get this little, it's almost like a palm top computer, and you can make it a very personalized experience. I didn't really know when I went. I went about a year and a half ago, and I didn't really know what I was getting into. And I've been to some interesting museums that have been a little bit of a letdown, but this is definitely not a letdown. I went in, and immediately, just every single thing you can imagine. I mean, they start more historical, kind of prehistory items there, all the way through to, I mean, they bring you through World War II. And the experiences in Singapore and what happened in Singapore, all the way through even modern day.
So they deal with the occupation of the Japanese in World War II?
They do address it in the museum itself. If you see a particular artifact, I remember one artifact that I saw was this bicycle that they kept from World War II, the Japanese occupation, 1942 to 1945. And there was a number on it, and you just type in the number on the tablet computer, and it'll bring up any information, video, audio, everything. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. One of the best museums I've been to.
And was this one of the bicycles the Japanese soldiers used to move down the Malay Peninsula?
Yes, yeah. In Malaysia,
I recall they caught the British a bit unaware by how fast they were able to move because they were using bikes.
Yes, correct.
Interesting.
Yeah. They have Fort Cicelo on Sentosa as well that you can go visit. I haven't seen it, but that was also significant during World War II. Also near the Clarke Quay and Boat Quay area is called the Asian Civilization Museum. This focuses more on historical elements within the area of Southeast Asia. So this is where you get more anthropology. I've heard that's also a very good museum as well. And then they also have an art museum, which has a lot of especially local artists. And then one thing that I can't go without mentioning is definitely the night safari. This was mentioned, I think, previously on your show when you did the Malaysia. They had the gentleman on for Malaysia. And this is essentially the Singapore Zoo. At night, they open up a particular area where you can get on these trams, and they'll take you around. It kind of reminds you, I mean, it's not like being in Africa at all, but it's all at night, and it's a bunch of animals that are out. It reminds you a little bit of Jurassic Park in that you kind of enter this area, but it's very safe, and the animals literally come right up to the tram. And there's certain areas you can get off. I remember there's actually a giant bat cage and had a very close encounter with a bat. So,
Close encounter with a bat. You just tucked my wife out of it.
but it's definitely worth to go see, and it's very reasonable price wise. And you can normally get deals with that too as a tourist. Another area that's interesting to visit is called Little India as well. That's very similar to kind of Chinatown, but obviously Indian influence there. And then Arab Street, which is just a little bit off of Chinatown area. And there's a particular area, this has a lot of different spices you can get there and all kinds of different fabrics. But also there's a very interesting, if I would recommend one mosque to go visit, there's the Sultan Mosque. I went there with a friend of mine that is Muslim, and he kind of showed me around, and it's very, very beautiful. There is a lot of mosques in Singapore, but this one especially is probably the largest.
And with the mosques, I assume that's mostly the Indonesian influence?
Yes, yeah, definitely the Muslim and the Indonesian influence within Singapore. And then also, if you do have some time, especially if you're staying for 2 weeks, there's the Changi Chapel and Museum. It focuses more on the Japanese occupation. I don't know if it's actually the original place where they had prisoners, but they have a little chapel there dedicated to those who lost their lives there. And then also one place that's actually very close to the turf club for where they do horse racings is out in this area called Kranji War Memorial. I actually visited that, and it was a very interesting experience because I think I never really realized when I lived in Singapore how much of a sacrifice not only Singaporeans but also the Malays, the people from New Zealand, Australians, and the British, how many lost their lives during the World War II involvement with the Japanese. It's kind of a secluded area, but it's very beautiful. That's where they have a lot of the graves there. And it's definitely worth to go see if you do have some time. And then kind of the last thing I would say is in regards to festivals, I kind of mentioned the Chinese New Year experience, but also I would say one other one that's definitely need to see is the Lantern Festival. And that's normally held, you can go to, it's called Chinese Garden. There's actually an MRT stop called that. And there's a Japanese and Chinese garden there, and they have all these lanterns. You can go at night. It's a very big event. The number one festival, if you're there to see it, I accidentally saw it, is Taipusam. My understanding is it isn't celebrated in many countries, but essentially it's the Hindu faith. And basically you need to see it rather than me describe it. Essentially, they take this journey from one temple to another temple, and they block off the roads, and the people that practice the faith actually get these, they remind you of open ocean fishing, these giant hooks, and actually pierce themselves all over their body. And it's connected to this giant, it's not a headdress, but some kind of, I don't know, religious something. I mean, if I can find a picture, I'll try to send it to you, but it's definitely very interesting, and it's a very religious experience for them and for their families. They walk, I don't know how many kilometers or whatever, but it's a very interesting to see. I accidentally saw it from a bus once I was going home and I saw it. Tourists and visitors are definitely welcome. I mean, obviously show kindness, and you can stay on the side, and they don't mind. You can ask if you can videotape, but it's a very interesting experience to see. And those are some of the things I'd definitely point out if you could stay for a week or two.
And while you're taking a breath there, language. I'm assuming I can get around very easily in English.
Yes, language is not a factor for English-speaking people. Due to the British influence, they speak British English. You will know some people kind of have a British accent. Some Singaporeans do. Also, they speak a lot of Mandarin. So if you are a Chinese traveler or if you know some Mandarin, you can get around easily. But definitely English, you'll have no problem. All the signs are in English. Normally the signs are in multiple language. And then kind of the third language is Malay, and then they have a 4 Tamil.
Okay. Getting around, you mentioned the transit system before. Anything we should know about navigating the transit system?
The public transportation in general is very easy to navigate. Especially, I mentioned the Mass Rapid Transit, the MRT. I'd say it's definitely more manageable than if you go to London and use the Underground.
Okay.
It's only, I think, 4 or 5 different lines, and they have added over the time like a light rapid transit. That's normally in the residential areas. But essentially, it's very reasonable price-wise. It makes it very easy to walk around. That's one aspect I really enjoy, is that you can pretty much grab a water bottle, grab whatever you need, some money, and then just hop on and go. The only drawback I'd say is the buses are a little confusing. I wouldn't say avoid them, but especially downtown, it can be a little confusing where the buses are going. You can always ask, especially if you ask local people, hey, I need to get to Holland Village. How do I get there? typically the places that I mentioned, you can easily get there by the MRT. And most of the time they're called Chinatown or Little India, for example.
okay.
Like you,
All right.
you can go directly there. It is very easy to use, basically like any subway type system. And they do have a Singapore tourist pass, which is basically $8 Singapore a day. But I would also recommend just to obtain a Transit Link card. And you can get these, I mean, for whatever value of money you'd like. You might even be good for about a week, especially if you're doing heavy traveling and you're not really going across the island or anything. I'd say you'd probably be good $15 per person. You go up, and it's just this card. I think it's magnetized, maybe not. And all you do is you wave it in front. Like if you go on a bus, you just wave it at this little indicator, and it marks that you got on the bus, and it says how much money you have. And then when you leave, you just wave it at the leaving indicator. On the MRT, how you get into the MRT, there's a little gate. You just wave it. Also, I'd recommend taxis. Taxis have gone up a little bit in price since years ago, but they are very, very easy to get around. I mean, Singapore is such a small place. Taxi drivers are very nice. They also are very accommodating for tourists. They know the big places, but it's definitely affordable. I remember I could get from the northern part of the island to the business district and for probably, I'd say, 15 Singapore dollars.
Okay.
So it's not that bad. I mean, maybe it's gone up a little bit. But I'd also recommend, too, taking taxi drivers and using the taxis in that they're a great resource. Talking with taxi drivers, I've had the most interesting conversations I've had while I've been in Singapore has been with some of the taxi drivers and just talking historical things to see. What do you recommend on this day? So definitely they're a good resource as well.
Okay. Places to stay. You mentioned that south of Beach Road there were some less expensive hotels. Anyone that you would particularly recommend?
That area, they consider it the Millennial Walk area. I have heard good things about. There's the Mandarin Hotel down that area. If you want to go to a famous hotel, which is actually the tallest in Southeast Asia, it's now called the Swiss Hotel. It's a very, very tall, and they have some good restaurants on the top of it. But that you'll find it's actually right next to the MRT stop at City Hall. You can get out, and it's right there. It's the new reclaimed area, and it's actually down the street from the Raffles Hotel. But those are some areas you can also find kind of the further away from the business district, and in the southern part of Singapore there, you can find some very reasonable. Orchard Road is where you'll find the Hyatts and the Shangri-Las and big hotels. But if you go off of a little bit, like I've stayed at the Traders Hotel, which is very close to the Botanical Gardens. It's actually next to this mall called Tanglein Mall, the Tanglein area. It's very reasonable price-wise.
Okay. As we start to wind down this a bit, the best day you've had in Singapore?
Oh, man. I've had so many good ones. Okay. I would definitely say one of the neatest days I've experienced is in the morning getting to Chinatown and spending some time looking at some of the shops and having, especially at lunch, I don't know if we talked about food at all.
Oh, don't
but
worry,
going
we'll
to
get
a
there.
hawker stand. Sooner or later, but going to a hawker stand and having some traditional Singaporean food, and then...
And hawkers, so we're talking about street food. What is typical street food in Singapore?
It's a good mix between Malaysian and influence through Indonesian experience too. So the neat thing in Singapore is that you really can't go wrong with the food. If you enjoy Chinese, you can find that, but it's normally Chinese with a twist. For example, at a hawker stand, normally what I'd get is satay, which is basically... I'm sure your listeners know, but you can get all kinds of different meats. You can get chicken, mutton, beef, and they normally dip it in a peanut sauce. So that's very similar to kind of like Indonesian food where you get it in a peanut sauce. You can get it very spicy. You can get a large variety like noodles. Like my favorite kind of noodle that I would normally get there is kway teow. It's very thick noodle, very wide. And I really enjoyed that. Like I always enjoy getting fried beef kway teow, which is very good.
So it sounds most similar to Thai cuisine to me.
Yeah, it's a mixture. I mean, you'll find also good Indian food as well. And you can find this all in hawker stands. But also in addition, I would recommend too, there's on the east coast of Singapore, it's most famous for their chili crab. Chili crab, basically they get crab and they put it in this very hot sauce. If you really enjoy spicy, it's very, very good. I haven't really mentioned, but seafood in Singapore, I never really ate a lot, but you can get very fresh fish daily. I mean, good lobster, everything. If you enjoy seafood, it's easy access, and there's great restaurants that serve that as well.
Makes sense. It sounds like you're never 5 miles from the ocean.
Right.
One warning you would give about going to Singapore. Don't spit on the sidewalks. I think we know that one from the news.
Yeah, beware of jaywalking. Actually, you'll find there's a touristy shirt that you can get that says Singapore is a fine city, and it lists all the different things you can't do.
On a practical basis, is this something I really need to worry about, or is it something that's over exaggerated by the press?
I think overall it is somewhat over exaggerated. I think if you are, very respectful to the culture and to the people, you'll be fine. I wouldn't worry.
You
I
said
wouldn't
you'll be
concerned.
fine, not you'll be fined, right?
Right.
Okay.
I would say I wouldn't be concerned too much with. There's all kinds of fines for spitting, for jaywalking. People always ask me about gum. It's perfectly legal to chew gum there. It's illegal to sell it. So,
Oh,
I mean,
funny. Okay.
in I want to say 93, 94, they opened up their brand new MRT system. And people kept on jamming gum in the door, which is all computerized, and it caused a lot of problems. So they got rid of gum in Singapore.
Huh.
However, you can, if you're from overseas and you need gum, or they have recently just allowed, you can get like Nicorette gum if you need that, if you have a doctor's prescription. But
Okay.
traveling, I don't think you really need that. But other things to be concerned about. I would say overall, I mean, some places you have to be very careful if you have belongings or if you have your wallet or money or anything. I would say Singapore overall, I mean, just like any other country in the world, you just you pay attention to that. And but overall, I mean, I'd say it's very safe. And with that too, I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think any other kind of things to be careful of. I mean, other than I just be careful of the weather.
You mentioned earlier before we started recording that you had tips about what you should carry with you. I'm assuming one is a water bottle.
Oh, definitely. Due to the high humidity, you'll sweat a lot. And always, I never left home when I lived there without an umbrella.
Oh, okay.
Pretty much year round, guaranteed. I mean, if you actually go online and look at the weather in Singapore, you'll find that every day there's like thunderstorms. That's true, but it only rains pretty heavily, maybe an hour a day. It is a tropical climate. I think as a traveler going to visit there, I definitely say don't be afraid to have one or two umbrellas, especially for your family
Okay.
if you're going. Oh, one thing I always forget is tipping. In Singapore, you don't need to tip when you go to restaurants. They have a thing called a general service tax, it's GST, and it's normally 10% or it's normally around there. I think it's 7% sometimes whenever I lived there. And essentially it's included. I think a few times if I've had really excellent service, I have tipped, but normally it's included in the price.
One very memorable person that you met in Singapore.
One of the neatest people I met was he worked at the church I went to in Singapore. He was a janitor. He was actually in the Changi prison I mentioned.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In Malaysia, he used to race motorcycles, and he lived in Singapore. And it's very interesting hearing his experience, especially how Singapore's changed. Even talking with people that lived there 20 years ago, how much on cutting edge they are with technology. And just each year, almost each day, there's something that changes.
Mm-hmm.
But just it's very interesting talking with him, with his experiences, very interesting stories. And just I think in my mind, I had it built up as a particular thing. And he said, well, it wasn't that restrictive. I mean, it was an occupied country. And he was a very interesting gentleman to talk with.
Interesting. If you had to summarize Singapore in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Let me think about this a second. I would say probably 3 words that kind of come to mind immediately is crossroads.
Okay.
As I mentioned,
I wondered if you might use that one.
I would say crossroads, humid. That references the weather around. And I would definitely say change. I mean, it's always, I have never gotten bored. Each year I've gone back, there's something new and exciting. Let it be attractions or they've improved certain areas. I would say that with the change, I would also mention that they do a great job catering to tourists. The people I've talked with and friends I've talked, I've never heard anyone that's been dissatisfied with their experience in Singapore. They do a great job just kind of investing in that, trying to make it a very friendly place for people to go visit.
Yeah, we have friends. I don't think they've done other international travel, and they went to Singapore, and they thoroughly enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned previously, I'd easily say Singapore is an excellent place, especially if you're kind of getting into the traveling, starting off. It's a very good place to be like a first location, especially in Southeast Asia or maybe even Asia in general, to visit because it's easy to get around. It's very clean, beautiful. There's a lot to do. And it's a good place to even start. I mean, a lot of times just your flights, whichever airline you fly, you'll end up there. And it's a good place just to spend a few days, even if you're returning or if you're going to Indonesia or wherever, just to return through Singapore. It's a good place too. There is plenty to do, and there's enough variety where if you have been, it's good to even go back and see new things. And that's what I always enjoy doing.
Well, do you have any last words of advice for somebody who's going to Singapore? Bring an umbrella.
Bring an umbrella, yes. Very warm, humid, so dress accordingly. You'll never feel out of place if you wear sandals. I'd just say the only word of caution, if you are going to temples or mosques, be careful, just like when you visit any other country with temples or mosques.
Yeah, dress appropriately.
But yeah, just clothing. It's tropical climate, dress light.
Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on the show twice to talk about Singapore.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And I assure you, I checked, and this one is recording, really.
All right.
Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Well, this show is running a little longer, and I'm also running a little later than usual, so we're going to skip the internet resources portion of this show. I did want to share with you a couple letters from the community. The first one comes from Alex in Indianapolis, who says, I have really enjoyed your podcast since I started listening about a year ago. Many of your podcasts have been quite insightful and interesting to me. Alex points out particularly, and I'm going to do this by episode number 93, 118, 123, and 138, just to name a few. Now, you're going to have to figure out what those means. I'll put links in the show notes. As a college student preparing to study and live abroad in Europe, primarily England, I plan on traveling much while there, and I hope that you will interview more students in the future who have studied abroad to get a better general idea of what to expect, and possibly people who have traveled through, lived in some Western Central European countries. I look forward to your next podcast. I do plan to interview more people who are students, more people who are retired. I really do like having the mix of people as well. So I do thank you for your letter, Alex, and I'm going to have to look up what those episodes are so I can put that in a link in the show notes. I got a letter from Daryl who said, my wife wants to know what luggage you use. She is a Microsoft Excel instructor, and she's on the road 2 weeks out of 4 each month. She seems to have to replace her luggage once a year. What type of luggage do you recommend? And I had to laugh out loud because I'm notoriously cheap, and so I have not spent a lot on luggage. And we actually are using some carry-on suitcases that are just starting to wear out now that I bought for about $20 at Long's Drugs back in early 2001, and if I look carefully I can still see our cabin number from a Barefoot Windjammer cruise written in chalk on the top, and they've been to Europe, might have been to Africa and Australia and such. I find that I really don't see a lot of advantage between real expensive luggage and inexpensive luggage. I say that with a little disappointment because I'd love to do an affiliate link to expensive luggage, but I'm not one of those people who sees that it necessarily lasts all that much longer. I'm sure it lasts longer, but whether it's a good cost value or not, I'm not sure. With that, we'll start to wrap down this episode. If you are looking for a way to help me celebrate the 3-year anniversary of the show, this would be a great opportunity if you haven't already reviewed the show on iTunes or voted for the show on Dig or StumbleUpon. I've got a number of links on the right sidebar of the show where you can support it by letting people know that you enjoy it, if you enjoy it. If you don't enjoy it, well, we don't need to share that. If you'd like to get a hold of me, please send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com or leave a comment on this show, or check out the comments that other people have put on it, or leave a comment in the discussion boards. And as always, thanks so much for listening.